Talk. Member for Oxford. 1847. There is not a feature or a point in the national character which has made England great among the nations of the world, that is not strongly developed and plainly traceable in our universities. For 800 or 1,000 years they have been intimately associated with everything that has concerned the highest interests of the country. Gladstone. In 1847 the fortunes of a general election brought Mr. Gladstone into relations that for many years to come deeply affected his political course. As a planet's orbit has puzzled astronomers until they discover the secret of its irregularities in the attraction of an unseen and unsuspected neighbor in the firmament, so some devious motions of this great luminary of ours were perturbations due in fact to the influence of his new constituency. As we have seen, Mr. Gladstone quitted Newark when he entered the cabinet to repeal the Corn Law. At the end of 1846, writing to Lord Lyttelton from Foscay, he tells him, "I wish to be in Parliament but coldly, feeling at the same time that I ought to wish it warmly on many grounds. But my father is so very keen in his protective opinions, and I am so very decidedly of the other way of thinking, that I look forward with some reluctance and regret to what must, when it happens, place me in marked and public contrast with him." The thing soon happened. I remained, he says, without a seat until the dissolution in June 1847. But several months before this occurred it had become known that Mr. Escart would vacate his seat for Oxford, and I became a candidate. It was a serious campaign. The constituency, much to its honor, did not stoop to fight the battle on the ground of protection. But it was fought, and that fiercely, on religious grounds. There was an incessant discussion, and I may say dissection, of my character and position in reference to the Oxford movement. This cut very deep, for it was a discussion which each member of the constituency was entitled to carry on for himself. The upshot was favorable. The Liberals supported me gallantly, so did many zealous churchmen, apart from politics, and a good number of moderate men, so that I was returned by a fair majority. I held the seat for 18 years, but with 5 contests and a final defeat. The other sitting member after the retirement of Mr. Escart was Sir Robert Harry Inglis, who had beaten Peel by a very narrow majority in the memorable contest for the university seat on the final crisis of the Catholic question in 1829. He was blessed with a genial character and an open and happy demeanor, and the fact that he was equipped with a full store of sincere and inexorable prejudices made it easy for him to be the most upright, honorable, kindly, and consistent of political men. Repeal of the Test Acts, relief of the Catholics, the Reform Bill, relief of the Jews, reform of the Irish Church, the grant to Maynooth, the repeal of the Corn Laws, one after another he had stoutly resisted the whole catalogue of revolutionizing change. So manful a record made his seat safe. In the struggle for the second seat, Mr. Gladstone's friends encountered first Mr. Cardwell, a colleague of his as Secretary of the Treasury in the late government. Cardwell was deep in the confidence and regard of Sir Robert Peel, and he earned in after years the reputation of an honest and most capable administrator, but in these earlier days the ill-natured called him Peel and Water, others labelled him latitudinarian and indifferent, and though he had the support of Peel, promised before Mr. Gladstone's name as candidate was announced, he thought it wise at a pretty early hour to withdraw from a triangular fight. The old Hyandry party and the Evangelical party combined to bring out Mr. Round. If he had achieved no sort of distinction, Mr. Round had at least given no offence. Above all, he had kept clear of all those tractarian innovations which had been finally stamped with the censure of the university 2 years before. Oxford supporters. Charles Wordsworth, his old tutor and now warden of Glenelmond, found it hard to give Mr. Gladstone his support, because he himself held to the high principle of state conscience, while the candidate seemed more than ever bent on the rival doctrine of social justice. Mr. Hallam joined his committee, and what that learned veteran's adhesion was in influence among older men, that of Arthur Clough was among the younger. Northcote described Clough to Mr. Gladstone as a very favourable specimen of a class, growing in numbers and importance among the younger Oxford men, a friend of Carlyle's, Frank Newman's, and others of that stamp, well read in German literature and an admirer of German intellect, but also a still deeper admirer of Dante, just now busily taking all his opinions to pieces and not beginning to put them together again, but so earnest in good that he might be trusted to work them into something better than his friends inclined to fear. Ruskin, again, who had the year before published the memorable second volume of his Modern Painters, he was still well under 30, was on the right side, and the Oxford chairman is sure that Mr. Gladstone will appreciate at its full value the support of such high personal merit and extraordinary natural genius. Scott, the learned Grecian who had been beaten along with Mr. Gladstone in the contest for the Ireland Scholarship 17 years before, wrote to him, "Ever since the time when you and I received stripes at the hand of the Vice-Chancellor, and so you became my mu omicron nu alpha sigma toi ota gamma alpha lambda alpha beta nu gamma nu omicron tau sigma alpha pi lambda eta gamma mu omicron." 199. I have looked forward to your being the representative of the university. Richard Greswell of Worcester was the faithful chairman of his Oxford committee now and to the end, 18 years off. He had reached the dignity of a Bachelor of Divinity, but nearly all the rest were no more than junior masters. Routh, the old president of Magdalen, declined to vote for him on the well-established ground that Christ Church had no business to hold both seats. Mr. Gladstone at once met this by the dexterous proposition that though Christ Church was not entitled to elect him against the wish of the other colleges, yet the other colleges were entitled to elect him if they liked, by giving him a majority not made up of Christ Church votes. His eldest brother had written to tell him in terms of affectionate regret that he could take no part in the election, mere political differences would be secondary, but in the case of a university, religion came first, and there it was impossible to separate a candidate from his religious opinions. When the time came, however, partly under strong pressure from Sir John, Thomas Gladstone took a more lenient view and gave his brother a vote. The Roundmen pointed triumphantly to their heroes' votes on Maynooth and on the Dissenters' Chapels Bill, and insisted on the urgency of upholding the principles of the United Church of England and Ireland in their full integrity. The backers of Mr. Gladstone retorted by recalling their champion's career, how in 1834 he first made himself known by his resistance to the admission of dissenters to the universities, how in 1841 he threw himself into the first general move for the increase of the colonial episcopate, which had resulted in the erection of 11 new sees in 6 years, how zealously with energy and money he had labored for a college training for the Episcopalian clergy in Scotland, how instrumental he was in 1846, during the few months for which he held the seals of Secretary of State, in erecting 4 colonial bishoprics, how the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, through the mouth of the Archbishop of Canterbury himself, had thanked him for his services, how long he had been an active supporter of the great societies for the spread of church principles, the propagation of church doctrines, and the erection of church fabrics. As for the Dissenters' Chapels Bill, it was an act of simple justice and involved no principles at issue between the Church and dissent, and Mr. Gladstone's masterly exposition of the tendency of dissent to drop one by one all the vital truths of Christianity was proclaimed to be a real service to the Church. The reader will thus see the lie of the land, what it meant to be member for a university, and why Mr. Gladstone thought the seat the highest of electoral prizes. The contest. A circular was issued impugning his position on Protestant grounds. "I humbly trust," wrote Mr. Gladstone in reply, July 26, "that its writers are not justified in exhibiting me to the world as a person otherwise than heartily devoted to the doctrine and constitution of our Reformed Church. But I will never consent to adopt as the test of such doctrine a disposition to identify the great and noble cause of the Church of England with the restraint of the civil rights of those who differ from her." Much was made of Mr. Gladstone's refusal to vote for the degradation of Ward. People wrote to the newspapers that it was an admitted and notorious fact that a sister of Mr. Gladstone's under his own influence had gone over to the Church of Rome, 200. The fable was retracted, but at once revived in the still grosser untruth, that he habitually employed a Jesuitical system of argument to show that nobody need leave the Church of England, because all might be had there that was to be enjoyed in the Church of Rome. Maurice published a letter to a London clergyman vigorously remonstrating against the bigoted spirit that this election was warming into life, and fervently protesting against making a belief in the Nicene Creed into the same thing as an opinion about a certain way of treating the property of Unitarians. One artifice of this kind, said Maurice, has been practiced in this election which it makes me blush to speak of. Mr. Ward called the Reformation a vile and accursed thing. Mr. Gladstone voted against a certain measure for the condemnation of Mr. Ward, therefore he spoke of the Reformation as a vile and accursed thing. I should not have believed it possible that such a conclusion had been drawn from such premises even by our religious press. The worthy Mr. Round, on the other hand, was almost impregnable. A diligent scrutiny at last dragged the dark fact to the light of day, that he had actually sat on Peel's election committee at the time of Catholic emancipation in 1829, and had voted for him against Inglis. So it appears, said the mocking Gladstonians, that the Protestant Mr. Round was willing to lend a helping hand to the first of a series of measures which are considered by his supporters as fraught with danger to the country's very best interests. A still more sinister rumor was next bruited abroad, that Mr. Round attended a dissenting place of worship, and he was constrained to admit that, once in 1845 and thrice in 1846, he had been guilty of this blacksliding. The lost ground, however, was handsomely recovered by a public declaration that the very rare occasions on which he had been present at other modes of Christian worship had only confirmed his affection and reverential attachment to the services and formularies of his own church. Victory at the poll. The nomination was duly made in the Sheldonian Theatre, July 29, the scene of so many agitations in these fiery days. Inglis was proposed by a canon of Christ Church, Round by the Master of Balliol, and Gladstone by Dr. Richards, the rector of Exeter. The prime claim advanced for him by his proposer was his zeal for the English Church in word and deed, above all his energy in securing that wherever the English Church went, thither bishoprics should go too. Besides all this, his masterwork, he had found time to spare not only for public business of the Commonwealth, but for the study of theology, philosophy, and the arts. 201. Then the voting began. The Gladstonians went into the battle with 1,100 promises. Northcote, 202, passing vigilant days in the Convocation House, sent daily reports to Mr. Gladstone at Foscay. Peel went up to vote for him, splitting for Inglis. Ashley went up to vote against him. At the close of the second day things looked well, but there was no ground for overconfidence. Inglis was 600 ahead of Gladstone, and Gladstone only 120 ahead of Round. The next day Round fell a little more behind, and when the end came, August 3, the figures stood: Inglis 1,700, Gladstone 997, Round 824, giving Gladstone a majority of 173 over his competitor. Numbers were not the only important point. When the poll came to be analyzed by eager statisticians, the decision of the electors was found to have a weight not measured by an extra 170 votes. For example, Mr. Gladstone had among his supporters 25 double firsts against 7 for Round, and of single first classes he had 157 against Round's 66. Of Ireland and Hertford scholars Mr. Gladstone had 9-2 and 3-1 respectively, and of Chancellor's prizemen who voted he had 45 against 12. Of fellows of colleges he had 218 against 128, and his majority in this class was highest where the elections to fellowships were open. The heads of the colleges told a different tale. Of these, 16 voted for Round and only 4 for Gladstone. This discrepancy it was that gave its significance to the victory. Sitting in the Convocation House watching the last casual voters drop in at the rate of 2 or 3 an hour through the summer afternoon, the ever-faithful Northcote wrote to Mr. Gladstone at Foscay. Since I have been here, the contest has seemed even more interesting than it did in London. The effect of the contest itself has apparently been good. It has brought together the younger men without distinction of party, and has supplied the elements of a very noble party which will now look to you as a leader. I think men of all kinds are prepared to trust you, and though each feels that you will probably differ from his set in some particulars, each seems disposed to waive objections for the sake of the general good he expects. The victory is not looked upon as Puseyite, it is a victory of the masters over the hebdomadal board, and as such a very important one. The heads felt it their last chance, and are said to have expressed themselves accordingly. The Provost of Queen's, who was among the dissatisfied supporters of Round, said the other day, he would rather be represented by an old woman than by a young man. It is not as a Maynoothean that you are dreaded here, though they use the cry against you and though that is the country feeling, but as a possible reformer and a man who thinks. On the other hand, the young men exult, partly in the hope that you will do something for the university yourself, partly in the consciousness that they have shown the strength of the magisterial party by carrying you against the opposition of the heads, and have proved their title to be considered an important element of the university. They do not seem yet to be sufficiently united to effect great things, but there is a large amount of ability and earnestness which only wants direction, and this contest has tended to unite them. Puseyism seems rather to be a name of the past, though there are still Puseyites of importance. Marriott, Mosley, and Church appear to be regarded as leaders, but Church, who is now abroad, is looked upon as something more, and I am told may be considered on the whole the fairest exponent of the feelings of the place. Stanley, Jowett, Temple, and others are great names in what is nicknamed the Germanising party. Lake, and perhaps I should say Temple, hold an intermediate position between the two parties. Whatever may have been the evils attendant on the Puseyite movement, and I believe they were neither few nor small, it has been productive of great results, and it is not a little satisfactory to see how its distinctive features are dying away and the spirit surviving, instead of the spirit departing and leaving a great sham behind it. Peculiarity of election. Of the many strange positions to which in his long and ardent life Mr. Gladstone was brought, none is more startling than to find him, as in this curious moment at Oxford, the common rallying point of two violently antagonistic sections of opinion. Dr. Pusey supported him, Stanley and Jowett supported him. The old school, who looked on Oxford as the ancient and peculiar inheritance of the Church, were zealous for him. The new school, who deemed the university an organ not of the Church but of the nation, eagerly took him for their champion. A great ecclesiastical movement, reviving authority and tradition, had ended in complete academic repulse in 1845. It was now to be followed by an anti-ecclesiastical movement, critical, skeptical, liberal, scornful of authority, doubtful of tradition. Yet both the receding force and the rising force united to swell the stream that bore Mr. Gladstone to triumph at the pole. The fusion did not last. The two bands speedily drew off into their rival camps, to arm themselves in the new conflict for mastery between obscurantism and illumination. The victor was left with his laurels in what too soon proved to be, after all, a vexed and precarious situation, that he could neither hold with freedom nor quit with honor. Meanwhile he thoroughly enjoyed his much-coveted distinction. To Mrs. Gladstone. Exeter Call, November 2, 1847. This morning, in company with Sir Inglis, and under the protection or chaperonage of the Dean, I have made the formal circuit of visits to all the heads of houses and all the common rooms. It has gone off very well. There was but one reception by a head, Corpus, that was not decidedly kind, and that was only a little cold. Marsham Merton, who was a frank, warm man, keenly opposed, said very fairly, to Inglis, I congratulate you warmly, and then to me, and I would be very glad to do the same to you, Mr. Gladstone, if I could think you would do the same as Sir Inglis. I like a man for this. They say the Dean should have asked me to dine today, but I think he may be, and perhaps wisely, afraid of recognizing me in any very marked way, for fear of endangering the old Christ Church right to one seat which it is his peculiar duty to guard. We dined yesterday in the hall at Christ Church, it being a grand day there. Rather unfortunately, the undergraduates chose to make a row in honor of me during dinner, which the two censors had to run all down the hall to stop. This had better not be talked about. Thursday the Warden of All Souls has asked me, and I think I must accept, had it not been ahead, and it is one of the little party of 4 who voted for me, I should not have doubted, but at once have declined. Footnotes, 199, Frogs, 756, the second line is Scott's own. An Aristophanic friend translates. Good brother Rogue, we shared the selfsame beating, at least, we carried off one stripe apiece. Stripe was the book given to Scott and Gladstone as being good seconds to the winner of the Ireland, see above page 61. 200, Standard, May 29, 1847. 201, the proposer's Latin is succinct, and may be worth giving for its academic flavor. Jam and aporitia literarum studioum beautis, etiam celeberamo et nensi gymnasio informatus, ad nostram accessit academiam, ubi morum honstate, pietate, iti pudor nemini equalium secundus, indoliti ingenio facil omnibus anticelibat. Sum misdane nostri academia honoribus cumulatus ad res civils cum magna omnium expectationis e consulat, expectationem in major omni evasit. In senatus enim domum inferiorem cooptatus, em ad negotia tractanda habilitatum, et ingenii perspicacitatum exhibebat, ut rea publici administrationis particeps et adjutor huc adolescens fieret. Quantum erga ecclesiam Anglicanam aegis studium non verba, sed facta, testenter. Is enim erat ca inter primos et perpacos sumo laborati eloquentia contendebat, ut ubiconc orbis terrarum ecclesia Anglicana pervenissit, episcopatus quoque everiter. Ite quamdiu e secretus regini fiat, ecclesia Anglicana apud colonos nostros plurimus locis labifactum sua obstabilivit, ite patrocinium aegis suspit. Nec vero publicis negotius adiois dedit quin theologiae, philosophiae, artium studio vacarit. Quae cum ita sint, esse delegatum, academici, coopter velimus, cacum omni laudi idem nostris rebus decus et tamen sit, etica summa eloquentia et argumenti 6, jura et libertates nostras tueri quit, hunc hodie suffragius nostris comprobimus. 202, Stafford Northcote had been private secretary to Mr. Gladstone at the Board of Trade. On the appointment of his first private secretary, Mr. Rawson, to a post in Canada in 1842, Mr. Gladstone applied to Coleridge of Eton to recommend a successor. He suggested three names: Farrer, afterwards Lord Farrer, Northcote, and Pocock. Northcote, who looked to a political career, was chosen. Mr. Gladstone, he wrote to a friend, June 30, 1842, is the man of all others among the statesmen of the present day to whom I should desire to attach myself. He is one whom I respect beyond measure. He stands almost alone as representative of principles with which I cordially agree, and as a man of business, and one who humanly speaking is sure to rise, he is preeminent. Lang's Life of Lord Iddesleigh, I. pages 63 to 67.